just time, Rhoda.
What does he mean?
In December of 2019, Lord of the Rings The Card Game players were treated to the release of the Hunt for the Dreadnought expansion. This expansion took Lord of the Rings The Card Game players to the open seas, as they did in the Dream Chaser cycle, and gave them the chance to deploy epic multiplayer mode. This was a great quest and ended up being one of the most expensive purchases I've ever made off of eBay. But the release was bittersweet, as this would be the last of the brand new expansions to be produced for Lord of the Rings The Card Game.
The last pages are for you, Sam.
While the Hunt for the Dreadnought marked the end of the main story of the Lord of the Rings The Card Game, the world would survive as we began a phase of repackaged expansions for the game. But it wasn't just that. This was an opportunity for fans to come into play and design fan-made expansion content. In today's video, part 6, kind of 7, but part 6 of the Lord of the Rings The Card Game's Retrospective,
The greatest modern card game.
we're going to talk about the supposed final phase of the Lord of the Rings The Card Game's life. The post-credit scenes, where we have the repackaged expansions, fan-made expansions, tools developed over the course of more than a decade of the game's life, and we're going to talk a little bit about the game that arguably replaced the Lord of the Rings The Card Game in the lives of many living card game players. I'm Jackson Warfield, and please join me as we board the last ship out of the Grey Havens and see what the Undying Lands have in store for us, fans of the Lord of the Rings, the card game. "2020 was a busy year for cooperative living card game players. Even aside from the fact that this was a year where, due to a lot of people being kind of locked in their homes, hobby games, card games would be on the rise like almost never before. For the first time in human history that we know of, 3 living card games were being actively produced. The Lord of the Rings The Card Game was in the midst of the Vengeance of Mordor cycle, which, as we've mentioned, was the last expansion cycle of the Lord of the Rings The Card Game.
Meanwhile,
The Arkham Horror The Card Game, the younger brother to Lord of the Rings The Card Game, was in the Dream Eaters cycle. This was cycle number 5 for that particular universe. Dream Eaters, I should say, has nothing to do with...
Welcome to the Dreamweavers, young one.
or... At least, I don't believe they have anything to do with that.
meanwhile,
There's a new kid on the block. This kid was bitten by a radioactive spider and suddenly was given the powers of streamlined cooperative play. Marvel Champions was released at the end of 2019 and thus saw its initial expansions come in late 2019 and early 2020. Marvel Champions was the newest version of the living card game model, and it was built in large part by designers that had experience with the other living card games. Astute players of games will notice Nate French and Caleb Grace with their names on the Marvel Champions box. Nate French is the original designer of the Lord of the Rings The Card Game, and Caleb Grace was the lead designer for the majority of the game's maturity. I mentioned before how Arkham Horror The Card Game shares a lot of DNA with the Lord of the Rings The Card Game. Like supervillains in a lab, Grace, French, and Michael Boggs modified that DNA to create the monster that is Marvel Champions. Marvel Champions is the most streamlined example of the Fantasy Flight cooperative living card game system. That is, if you want to play a cooperative card game with a 50-ish card deck, Marvel Champions is the fastest way to get that game played. The way Marvel Champions works, all players are one hero, and their deck of cards are different support items and allies for that hero. Each scenario is a different bad guy, a different boss, and each cooperative game of Marvel Champions is effectively a boss battle, albeit a boss battle that plays out where sometimes you're fighting and sometimes you're scheming. Here are some ways that the games compare. With Lord of the Rings The Card Game, first you have a quest phase, and then you have a combat phase. And a big aspect of how the game plays is making decisions on how much to commit to quests without knowing what you're truly going to need in the combat phase, making judgment calls like that, and trying to manage your risk. Arkham Horror the card game instead replacing the quest phase with skill tests where you will try to make progress on objectives as you are going from card to card like locations. So it's a bit more thematic, although also a little bit more tactical. But it's not too different. You could make Lord of the Rings the card game scenarios to play kind of like Arkham Horror the card game if you so chose. Marvel Champions keeps a lot of that, but simplifies it even more. In Marvel Champions, in each round of play, you're going to be declaring whether or not it is a round for scheming or a round for combat. You don't have to do both in every round. The way you do this is by flipping your hero from hero form to alter ego form. In alter ego form, it's all about scheming. In hero form, it's all about fighting. This decision serves to streamline the game because you have less to consider in a given turn. The turns play faster. There's less going on. As a result, the decisions are, as part of being streamlined, the decisions you're making are a little bit simpler. The way you manage risk between progress in the overall boss battle through scheming versus combat and dealing with your immediate problems is in the decision of whether to go alter ego or hero. And once you make that decision, it becomes more clear what you need to do in a given turn. In Lord of the Rings the card game, and to a certain extent in Arkham Horror the card game, you're keeping both plates in the air at the same time. So the risk management decisions are more persistent and continuous.
Schemes and plots are the same thing.
As a result, the game is a little bit more complex, but arguably deeper at the same time. Marvel Champions also streamlines other corners of the game. For example, resource tokens are gone. Instead, you discard cards as resources. Now, this obviously reduces the number of components you have in the game, and for some people that enjoy this type of mechanic, it will feel like a natural fit. And actually, with Marvel Champions, it works fairly well because you draw back up to a hand size every turn, so it's less of a challenge deciding what you want to discard, because some cards you'd want to discard them anyway, so you may as well use them for resources. It can lead to a little bit of analysis paralysis when you have to decide whether or not to play a card or whether or not to use it as a resource. This is where some people have issues with games like Race for the Galaxy, where your resources are cards, which is kind of what the Marvel Champions has done here and what Arkham Horror does to an extent as well. I actually prefer this separation of resource tokens from cards that you get in Lord of the Rings, the card game. I don't think that particular tweak on the rules that Marvel Champions has deployed is a streamlining, but that might just because of the way my brain works. With the Lord of the Rings the card game's print run ending, players had the options to potentially jump into Arkham Horror the card game, and now they had the option to jump into Marvel Champions. If a player wanted thematic experiences similar to dungeon crawling board games, Arkham Horror the card game is going to give more of that feel. If players were more interested in getting quick games together, Marvel Champions is a natural fit. The deck construction aspects of Marvel Champions are streamlined. You get your heroes, you make a few adjustments to your deck, everyone has nemesis and weakness cards you kind of shuffle in. You don't have a ton of deck construction options, and that's by design so you can get the games played quickly. Marvel Champions also, by virtue of being only boss battles, is less immersive, provides less of a narrative experience than even Lord of the Rings the card game does. The fact that all the games are boss battles meant it felt a little bit flat for me. It feels like I could have been playing through things that happen in between fighting the big bads. But I'm not going to deny the fact that Marvel Champions is very clean. And there's an appeal to Marvel Champions that Lord of the Rings the card game doesn't have. There's something to be said for having hero packs tightly themed around one hero. If you're walking through the aisles of a game store and you see a box of cards for Captain America, and then you see one for Thor, and then Hulk, you pick your favorite, all your friends pick your favorites, you go home, you play them. There's something to be said about that appeal. You don't get that appeal with the Lord of the Rings the card game. It's not as tidy of a package. Lord of the Rings the card game, your team is more cobbled together. It's a ragtag team of misfits. You're going to have some hobbits with some rangers, with some elves that we're maybe not even totally sure why they're there. Sacrificed deck construction elements that make the Lord of the Rings the card game a deep and rewarding experience to get into, and replace them with tight branding that hits your spinal cord in a way that makes you just want to buy it. If you're playing Lord of the Rings the card game because you wanted to do deck construction, but you didn't want to get into Magic the Gathering or Pokemon the trading card game, that was kind of lost until a third option emerged, which it would, not too long after the end of the Lord of the Rings card game's official release cycles. In the same month that The Hunt for the Dreadnought was released, another announcement was made by Fantasy Flight Games that rocked the living card game community. The Fantasy Flight Games forums were shutting down. Now, this might not have been a big deal for many games, but this was a big deal for Lord of the Rings the card game, especially. The Fantasy Flight forums were the place to go for rules clarifications. And when you're dealing with a game that has, at this point, 9 years of expansions, you're going to need some rules clarifications. Not only was the game ending, but the forums were going away. This was a skies falling situation for Lords of card game fans. So people were trying to find ways to capture all of the knowledge of the last 9 years. And a lot of the rules clarifications that were offered by designers like Caleb Grace, they went right into the forum. At this point, there wasn't a errata or a rules clarification to be officially released for the game in a couple years. Now, the community has survived through this, and most of these rules clarifications have either reappeared on Board Game Geek or otherwise findable somewhere on the internet. There actually is a website, too. The FFG Forum Archive is there if you really need to find something from the past. But I will say that the mood at the time was that things seemed to be ending. Players needed a bit of a life raft. They needed something to look forward to here. Because players have been playing this game for years, and not a lot of people wanted to live through the day when the courage of men failed. So who came to save the day? Well, many of the content creators for the community came together to produce something that was not entirely unexpected. In March of 2021, we saw the beginning of A Long Extended Party. Not to be confused with A Long Expected Party from the Lord of the Rings story. A Long Extended Party was the most fleshed out fan expansion of the Lord of the card game to date. Fan-made expansions were not new in 2021 for the Lord of the card game. Early in the game's history, you had for example, Ninja Dorg scenarios, which were quest cards put out for the core set. One of the biggest criticisms of the original Lord of the card game core set was that it was too difficult. Ninja Dorg, who I think went on to actually do some legit game design down the road. Ninja Dorg produced scenarios that were easier than some of the ones in the core set. It gave you something else to do with those cards and also used some of the unique characters that had no part to play in the original story. In 2014, Ian R. Martin of Tales from the Cards created the fan-made expansions The First Age, where if you've read the Silmarillion, playing the First Age expansions feels a little bit like playing a card game where you can have a hero that's like, Jesus or Moses or Muhammad. It's like there's something untouchable about the First Age lore that gets firmly touched in this expansion. Well done, though. Stories of the First Age are some of Tolkien's best works, and some of the characters, despite having no dialogue in the Silmarillion, are very memorable. Probably my favorite hero of this fan-made set is Fingolfin, which I think is how it's pronounced. I don't think it's Fingolfin. But Fingolfin is an excellent defender. That 4 defense and 6 health is pretty strong, and that fits the lore because Fingolfin was known for battling Morgoth in single combat. You also had the Mastery Sphere, which is all about corruption. You see Feanor in there. Tell you what, the quality of the First Age really shows what fans can do. Eventually, Mark Lammer, the creator of Vision of the Palantir, would create the Legacy of Feanor series of expansions and get the unique ally out there, Fatty Lumpkin. These scenarios are very well done, but the crown jewel of fan-made expansions was A Long Extended Party. Now, people have mixed opinions on fan-made expansions.
It's just beyond this door.
What is?
My playroom.
Like your Xbox and stuff?
Most players of games tend to not continue on and find the fan-made expansions, and there are a number of reasons for this. One, without a publisher for a game, the products themselves can be difficult to get. 2, without a publisher name backing a product, even sometimes with the publisher name backing a product, changing who's making the product means that it's a bit of an unknown in terms of quality. There's at least an illusion of deep play testing going on when you have a game that has the same publisher name against every expansion. So if you go to a fan-made expansion, the image of a bunch of guys like you in a garage coming up with scenarios, it's understandable to not want to spend a ton of time or money to get your hands on that, thinking that it would be a disappointment. Now, those tendencies aren't always fair, because if you look at the actual quality of this product and fan-made expansions for other games, it is very often at or even sometimes above the original product. The second most frequently featured game on my channel is Heroescape, and Heroescape is a miniatures game that ended its publishing run in 2011 and went into fan-made expansion territory and stayed there for over a decade. The fan-made expansions for Heroescape, the card mechanisms got more advanced, even while you were trying to pick up the miniatures by virtue of buying miniatures from other games and kind of mashing it all together. In physical terms, sloppy, but mechanically was actually very tight. When Heroescape came back, those that had gotten into the fan-made expansions were not exactly happy to see its return. After all, the game had evolved into something new. This new officially published version of the game wasn't going to fit in perfectly with that anymore. The Heroescape community had taken a bit of a turn. But Heroescape went 13 years between print runs. Lord of the Rings, the card game, only had to go 2 years before repackaged expansions came out. And it wasn't new stuff anyway, so we already knew it was all going to work. So it was a welcome addition to see some of these repackaged expansions and see them released. From a mechanism standpoint, went beyond anything that the original published game would go to. And the sky's the limit when you're talking about fan-made expansions. You can work anything into the game that you'd like. And when you're looking at fan-made expansions for the Lord of the Card game, characters that never made it into the original game that in theory could have gone in there are getting inserted. For example, in a long extended party, some of the cards you'll see are Goldberry, Tom Bombadil's wife, and the Blue Wizards, 2 of the 5 Istari, that is the wizards that came to Middle-earth. So you had Gandalf, Saruman, Radagast. We all know them. Most people don't know Alatar and Palando. They're left as a big unknown in Tolkien's lore to say they were helpful in the East. We don't know how, and that mystery is actually part of what makes Middle-earth an interesting location, is mysteries like that where we don't have everything fully explained to us. But if you want to play with them, this is the time to do it. Maybe there'll be a TV show or video game at some point that invokes Alatar and Palando, the Blue Wizards. But if you don't want to wait years or decades for that to happen, a fan-made expansion for a well-established card game is a great place to do that. If you want to get any of the fan-made content for the Lord of the Rings card game, now is your time, because one of the superhero of the Lord of the Rings card game, Doug Beer, has produced an MB print order that I will link to in this description, where if you're watching this video by the end of June 2025, you can get in on a discount deal to get the fan-made expansions more clearly than it probably will be in the future. Now, despite everything I'm saying in support of fan-made expansions, I'm going to be honest, I don't plan to play the fan-made expansions, at the very least with the level of vigor that I played the Fantasy Flight Games official published expansions. And I have spent some time wondering why that is. Imagining, like, am I just brainwashed by commercialism?
And this is what you think brings happy?
I don't think it's that simple. I think in a similar way to the appeal of Marvel Champions, in that it's presented in that nice clean package, and you can buy, say, the Captain America pack, and you know this is the Captain America pack, and you feel like you have the Captain America pack. That aspect of the Lord of the Card game, to say, oh, it's a Fantasy Flight Games product, here's a new official expansion, this is going to fit into my existing collection, the cards are going to match. There's a human instinct, I think, to collect things, especially for, a lot of, middle-aged men like me. In fan-made expansions, it breaks away from the core product in ways that, while awesome, I'm glad it exists, you can only play so much of a game in your life. I guess what I'm saying is similar to how Fantasy Flight Games and the designers of the game thought that the game was a complete game. There's something nice about having a complete game now in my collection. My time in Middle-earth is more as a human, as opposed to an immortal elf. But while anyone would have expected that the game eventually would stop getting new expansions, and those making fan-made expansions were ready to go as soon as this publishing run ended, what was not expected, that this really wasn't the end. In fact, the game was coming back. Before the game came back, however, there was another Fantasy Flight game that was released within the Lord of the Rings universe. And for anybody that thought that a game on cards wasn't as immersive as a game could be, this game wasn't just in cards. It was also on a board, and also in an app. In 2019, Fantasy Flight Games released Lord of the Rings Journeys in Middle-earth, inspired in 2 ways. One, it obviously takes place in Middle-earth like the Lord of the Rings card game does. 2, it was also inspired by the Arkham Horror-themed board game Mansions of Madness. So unlike with the card game where the Lord of the Rings game came first and then the Cthulhu game came later, here we had the Cthulhu game coming first, and then the Lord of the Rings version coming after the fact. Now, given the release of the game being in 2019, I would imagine a lot of people at Fantasy Flight Games thought that people would be jumping from the Lord of the Rings card game into the new expandable Lord of the Rings game of Journeys in Middle-earth. While that may have been the plan for a while, Journeys in Middle-earth did not have the staying power that Lord of the card game did. If you play the game, you'll actually notice a lot of the artwork is been reused, and a lot of the heroes that you get in Journeys in Middle-earth, the characters you actually play with, are kind of the same ones you get in the core set of Lord of the Rings card game, including the non-canonical ones that have now been around since Middle-earth Quest in 2009, namely Eleanor and Barivor. Journeys in Middle-earth also required an app to play, which is something that board gamers are always suspicious of, to be honest. But the game would only end up getting 8 expansions. Of these 8 expansions, 2 of them were legit expansions, Spreading War and Shadowed Paths. You had 3 figure packs, Villains of Eriador, Dwellers in Darkness, and Scourges of Wastes. You also had 3 digital expansions where you used the content you already had. Really, you could say the game only had 2 expansions. It just didn't take off the way the Lord of the Card game did. If that was your getting off point for the game, it left you ready to get back into the game in about 2022. Before the game was re-released, there was a hint that it might have been re-released as something entirely different. There's this magazine company called Hatchet, and there are a couple issues in the United Kingdom release for the Lord of the Rings: The Card Game magazine. If you can imagine playing the Lord of the Card Game as a magazine subscription where within the magazine itself are the scenarios you play and the cards that just come with issues of the magazine, that was going to be a thing, it looks like, for a bit. At least some issues were put out in the UK. Now, I don't know if there's something about British people and magazines. The only other instance I'm familiar with where you have a magazine-like subscription for a big tabletop game is Warhammer. Games Workshop being a British company, you end up getting like $1,000 worth of Warhammer miniature sprues and stuff where you're paying like $10 a month for a while. They had 5 issues of this. It was an interesting idea. I guess it wasn't impossible that this would have been the new version of Lord of the Card Game as opposed to the repackaged cycles. But it seems like it was a bit of a test product that was eschewed in favor of repackaged expansions. Purchased is one of the things. Kind of happy they didn't go in the magazine route because finding missing magazines would probably be tough. I can't see game stores stocking like 20 different issues of a magazine unless it was a very targeted shop. It seemed like it would be a big thing where you're chasing things on eBay for a while if you didn't get the initial subscription. I can understand not going in that direction, but it's fun to think about.
We must be quick.
The revised core set for the Lord of the Rings: The Card Game was released in 2022. The revised core set would fix some of the problems of the initial core set. For example, the fact that you had to buy 2 core sets to play with 4 threat counters. And it would provide extra cards on some of the cards that for some reason you only got 1 of in the original core set. Like, that was kind of dumb. 1 Dwarven Tomb. It was kind of silly. The game would also add campaign mode. You would also get, only a month later, the Dark of Mirkwood expansion, which extended the core set's 3-quest campaign into a 5-quest campaign. All the lessons that had been learned through the release of Arkham Horror, the card game, through Marvel Champions, and through the various Lord of the Rings expansions over the years have now been incorporated back into the core set. Assuming you're watching this video somewhat close to when it was released in 2025, that version of the core set is on shelves today. Let's be real, it's the same game, and it's not a new edition. It's a revised set. So whereas the core set was the taco, this is the Crunchwrap Supreme. All those tortillas, cheeses, meats, and vegetables from 2011 through 2020 were about to get repackaged like a giant burrito at Chipotle and given back to you again, which sounds less appealing when I put it that way. You also now have starter decks, and at this point you only have 4 starter decks. Maybe one day we'll get more starter decks, but you have 4 starter decks that will help kickstart your deck construction experience. You have the Defenders of Gondor, the Dwarves of Durin, the Elves of Lorien, and the Riders of Rohan. These decks are not self-contained decks the way Marvel Champions hero packs are. Rather, they are decks you could play by themselves, but they're really meant to just be more tools to build decks with the cards you have in the core set and with any other sets that you might happen to have. These decks are nudging you in the direction of what to play, but they're not telling you what to play. And I think the fact that these starter decks are not named after one hero and are instead named after groups of characters tells you what really is different between Marvel Champions and the Lord of the Rings: The Card Game. I think Marvel Champions is a good game, but for me personally, Marvel games are never going to measure up to Middle-earth games. There's something about the mortal hero leading the way that is much more enticing to me for a story, and for a game for that matter. Part of the whole point of Lord of the Rings is that Frodo, who would be no more than a child to your eyes, is arguably the #1 hero for all of Middle-earth. Someone who's 4 feet tall and is the opposite of a superhero. I'm much more interested in Frodo's story as a regular short dude who's never going to leave the Shire being asked to then save the world than I am someone who was bitten by a radioactive spider, has now great powers, and has the ability to save the world, and now just has to not waste their power. I don't know if you've noticed, but I have not been bitten by a radioactive spider. Most likely, you have not been bitten by a spider either. Think that the immortal hero story has some appeal, especially for those that have lived long enough to know that for a fact, you're not going to be bitten by a radioactive spider. You're almost certainly not going to inherit Brewster's millions. If you're going to make a difference in the world, it's going to be the hard way. So I like stories and I like games that feed into that trope. To be fair, there are some characters in Lord of the Rings that are like superheroes. Gandalf is like a superhero, but he's a support character. Aragorn is kind of a superhuman, but he's matching up against Sauron, who is more than even a demigod. He's basically a god. That battle between Aragorn and that big troll at the Battle of the Black Gate in Return of the King, they originally filmed that with him battling Sauron, if I remember the special features from the DVDs properly. But that's part of why I find the Lord of the Rings, the card game, so appealing, and why I don't see myself ever fully moving off into a game like Marvel Champions. After the revised core set and the Dark of Mirkwood expansion pack and all the starter decks, we now saw the releases of the repackaged content. This was the re-releasing of the greatest hits of the game. So we're talking the older band members touring the world, just playing the hits. That's a real phase that rock bands go through, and it's a worthwhile phase for this game. We've officially entered the second generation of the same game, where you have the same content you saw in the first decade, now being repackaged in a way that makes it more fun. The game is also set up to make it easier to get into the game. For one, the idea of expansions is done with. You're no longer going to have expansions for the game that you might see for $5 on clearance at Miniature Market, because you can't play it anyway if you were to buy it, because the expansion you need to play that expansion is no longer available. That's no longer a thing. The 3 expansion cycles that earned the repackaging treatment and the new campaign treatment were Angmar Awakened, the Dream Chaser, and Ered Mithrin. I've talked about this a little bit early in the series, but these were the best expansion cycles in the game. Angmar Awakened, arguably the best player cards. Dream Chaser, arguably the best campaign. Ered Mithrin, arguably the best combination of both. I would have loved to see a Haradrim repackaged expansion, but I can understand drawing the line here. These expansions were then re-released in separate hero expansions and campaign expansions. So if you just needed more player cards, you get the hero expansion. You just need the quests, you get the campaign expansion. No longer are the games being released and you kind of have to buy things where you only want 20% of what you buy. You also had the re-releases of the Lord of the Rings saga, the high point of the game. And playing through the Lord of the Rings saga is a high point in tabletop Playing through the Lord of the Rings saga in the Lord of the Rings card game is one of the high points as a tabletop gamer, period. If you played this game and you haven't attempted to go through the saga campaigns, and well, really it's one saga campaign for Lord of the Rings, I recommend it highly. In fact, that's a potential angle that we could take the channel in, is I could do playthroughs on those quests. The Ered Mithrin and Return of the King repackaged expansions were released at the end of 2024, around when I began this video series. And it seems like this is the end of the official Fantasy Flight Games releases for the game. Seems. There is an article released on Fantasy Flight Games' website on February 7th of 2025. The article is Designer Journal, Introducing Current and Legacy Environments. The idea being that old enough cards are basically too hard to keep balanced, and they're no longer going to be like in rotation. This is something that trading card game players will be familiar with, because when a trading card game gets past a certain point, you get too many cards that there are just going to be too many loopholes in how to play the game, and the game will inevitably break. What's interesting about this is that this article wasn't just about Marvel Champions and Arkham Horror, the card game. They mentioned Lord of the Rings, the card game. They have a picture of it right in the article. No one has ever said more expansions are coming for Lord of the Rings, the card game. In fact, they've pretty heavily implied that they were ending it. But the fact that it's been added here makes me wonder, and makes a lot of people wonder too. Maybe it doesn't make everyone wonder. Some people are just saying, no, this is it. And this could just be, if you're going to have a Lord of the Rings, a card game event, and it's going to be a competitive event to see who can accomplish quests most effectively, that you can't play with cards that weren't part of the repackaged content beginning in 2022. That might be all this is. But I don't think it's an accident that the door has been left open just a crack, because why not? They don't need to kill the Lord of the Card game. And I've actually seen now in 2025, I've seen more of this game on the shelves than I ever have before. If you didn't get into the game in the first 10 years of the game, you didn't need to. It can be new for you now. It's well designed. There's a lot to do. Why do they have to say the game is canceled? They don't need to. They could, in fact, that probably would be bad for sales. They could down the road decide to release more packs. Maybe they could release more starter decks. It's very possible they release more starter decks. They could release individual scenarios that are just streamlined versions of previous ones. For example, take the Nightmare version of Conflict at the Carrack and make that its own quest. Maybe they take the Battle of Lake Town where you battle Smaug, or any of the battles with Durin's Bane, and have them almost in Marvel Champions style boss battle one-off encounters. They can make it part of the campaign, or they could choose not to. In fact, there are a lot of bosses to choose from in Lord of the Rings, the card game. Watcher in the Water, Saruman, the Witch King, any of the ones that Fantasy Flight Games kind of invented within the Middle-earth lore. Things could be on the horizon for the game. I hope they are, and I also hope that they reprint Hunt for the Dreadnought for anyone that still wants to buy that, because that was pretty expensive to get. But all that being said, if you want to keep playing the game and you even can't get your hands on some of the materials, there is more out there for you. Before I finish the series, I definitely want to mention Dragon Cards. Dragon Cards is a web interface where you can actually play the Lord of the Rings card game. It was developed by C-Stan, who has developed many things, including RingsDB for Lord of the Rings the card game, that make the game actually more fun to play. Dragon Cards has effectively replaced Octagon as the best virtual card game implementation of Lord of the Rings the card game. Better than anything you might end up seeing on Tabletop Simulator. And it's actually the game as opposed to the Lord of the Rings the card game or adventure card game video game, which is not really the game. This is the game in digital format.
My dear Sam, you cannot always be torn in two. You will have to be one and whole for many years.
I want to be sure
There's so
to
much
thank
to
anyone
enjoy
who had a
and to
hand in
be
the creation of this game,
and to do.
especially designers Nate French and Caleb Grace. Thank you very much for making this game. And thank you to all the playtesters and the unnamed playtesters, and there are other designers to help with different expansions and the Nightmare expansions, and all the artists. A lot of people had to do with building of this game. Obviously, I've made a multiple hour video series on this. It's impacted my life, and it's impacted the lives of many. Thank you. I believe I've made my case for why the Lord of the Rings, the card game, is the
Greatest modern card game.
What do you see on the horizon? Why do the white gulls call across